Jaden Carter sat in the back row of his high school classroom, doodling absent-mindedly in his notebook. At 17 years old, he was tall for his age, with warm brown skin, sharp cheekbones, and thick black curls that he often kept tied back. His deep-set brown eyes carried an intensity that few people noticed. He had a quiet confidence about him, but to the world, he was invisible, except when he was being ridiculed. Teachers dismissed him. Classmates mocked him. Even some of his own family members had given up on him, calling him a troublemaker because he didn't always follow the rules. But Jaden wasn't rebellious. He was observant. He saw things others overlooked, patterns others ignored. His mind worked in ways that didn't fit neatly into the rigid structures of school. Yet, the word that followed him the most was dumb. His algebra teacher, Mr. Calloway, had once sighed in frustration when Jaden asked a question. "Why don't you just accept that you're not built for this kind of thinking?" The words had stung. The chuckles from his classmates had been worse. But Jaden never argued. He just clenched his jaw and endured it. Deep down, he knew he was capable of more. But how could he prove it when no one believed in him? Each morning, Jaden woke up at 5 a.m. to help his mother, Denise Carter, prepare for her shift at the local diner. She worked long hours to keep their small apartment running, and Jaden did what he could, cooking breakfast for his younger sister, Kiera, packing their lunches, and making sure she got to school on time. At Lincoln High, he blended into the background. His grades weren't terrible, but they weren't great either. Not because he didn't understand the material, but because he had stopped trying. The effort seemed pointless when teachers expected him to fail. During lunch, he sat alone at the farthest table in the cafeteria, scrolling through articles on his phone. He loved reading about law, famous court cases, and legal loopholes that had changed history. No one knew about his obsession. Why would they? A dumb kid like him had no business dreaming of a future in law. After school, he worked part-time at a local convenience store. It wasn't glamorous, but it put a little extra money in his pocket and helped his mom with bills. Some nights, he'd sit on their apartment's fire escape, staring at the city skyline, wondering if his life would ever amount to more. But deep down, something burned inside him. A hunger, a need to prove them wrong. Jaden lived in Eastbridge, a neighborhood in the heart of the city. It was the kind of place where dreams were often swallowed by reality, where the streets hummed with the sounds of car horns, distant sirens, and kids playing basketball on cracked asphalt courts. The neighborhood wasn't all bad, but opportunities were scarce, and hope was often fleeting. At school, Lincoln High was no different. It was a place where students were either expected to succeed or expected to fail. There was no middle ground. The gifted kids had their own advanced classes, their names posted on bulletin boards in the hallway, their achievements celebrated at school assemblies. Jaden wasn't one of them. Instead, he was placed in remedial classes with students who didn't care, teachers who had given up, and counselors who didn't bother pushing them toward college. The message was clear. Kids like him weren't supposed to go far. The courtroom, however, was another world entirely. It was a place of rules, logic, and justice, at least in theory. Jaden had never stepped foot in one before, but he had watched trials online, fascinated by how lawyers could bend words like weapons, dismantling arguments with precision. It was a world he secretly longed to be a part of, but no one would ever take him seriously. Not when the world had already decided who he was. Everything changed the day he was forced to step into a courtroom, not as a lawyer, but as a witness. A minor altercation had spiraled out of control. His best friend, Malik, had been accused of something he didn't do, and now he was facing serious charges. The so-called evidence against him was weak, but the public defender assigned to the case didn't seem to care. "They'll walk all over him," Jaden muttered under his breath as he sat in the back of the courtroom. When Malik's attorney botched his defense, Jaden couldn't hold back. He knew the facts. He had studied enough legal cases to see the flaws in the prosecution's argument. But when he spoke up, the reaction was immediate. A smirk from the prosecutor, an eye roll from the judge, and then the words that would change everything. "Sit down, son. You don't know what you're talking about." Jaden's blood boiled. For years, he had been dismissed, ignored, and underestimated. But this time, he wasn't going to stay silent. Because, for the first time in his life, he had proof that they were wrong about him. Jaden sat rigid in the back row of the courtroom, his fingers clenched into fists. His best friend, Malik Johnson, stood at the defendant's table, his face a mask of frustration and fear. Malik had been accused of stealing a wallet at a convenience store, a crime he hadn't committed. The so-called evidence against him? A grainy security camera clip showing someone in a hoodie near the register. The actual thief had the same build and wore similar clothes, but anyone who knew Malik would have spotted the differences immediately. The public defender, however, barely seemed interested. "Your Honor," the defense lawyer muttered, flipping through his notes. "My client maintains that he was not at the scene during the time of the incident." The prosecutor smirked. "And yet, the footage says otherwise." Jaden's jaw tightened. He had watched enough trials to know how this worked. Malik was just another black teen in the system, and the court didn't care whether he was guilty or not. The public defender wasn't fighting for him. He was just going through the motions. "Do you have an alibi, Mr. Johnson?" the judge asked. Malik hesitated. "I was at the rec center playing basketball with Jaden." Jaden's heart pounded. That was true, but no one had asked him to testify. The judge sighed. "Unless there's evidence to support that, it's not much of a defense." Jaden gritted his teeth. Evidence. There was evidence. The rec center had security cameras too. If anyone had bothered to check, they would have seen that Malik couldn't have been at the store during the time of the crime. But no one had bothered. And as the case unfolded, it became painfully clear that they weren't interested in the truth. Jaden could feel his pulse in his ears as he watched the lawyer fumble through his weak defense. He glanced at Malik's mother, Mrs. Johnson, who sat in the front row, her hands clenched together in silent prayer. This wasn't right. The public defender barely pushed back on the prosecution's claims. He missed obvious points, failed to object when he should have, and seemed content to let Malik's fate be sealed. Jaden had seen enough. His mind raced, recalling hours of legal arguments he had read. The prosecution's case had holes, big ones, but no one was pointing them out. He leaned forward, adrenaline coursing through him. His hands trembled, but not with fear, with determination. The judge was about to move forward when Jaden's voice cut through the silence. "That's not true," he blurted out. All eyes snapped to him. "What did you say?" the judge asked, frowning. Jaden swallowed hard, but stood his ground. "The prosecution is misleading the court. Malik couldn't have been at the store because we were at the rec center. And if you check the rec center's security cameras, you'll see that." A few chuckles echoed through the room. The prosecutor sighed, shaking his head. "And who are you exactly?" Jaden straightened his back. "Someone who actually cares about justice." The courtroom fell silent. The moment Jaden spoke, the entire courtroom shifted. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Son, this is not a debate club. Sit down before I hold you in contempt." Jaden's heart pounded, but he didn't back down. If the truth matters, why won't anyone look at the footage? Murmurs rippled through the room. Even Malik's public defender turned to glance at him, looking mildly surprised. The prosecutor scoffed. "This kid thinks he's a lawyer." A few people chuckled. The judge sighed. "Unless you are a licensed attorney or a direct witness, you have no place interrupting these proceedings." Jaden's stomach twisted. This was the moment where most people would sit back down, accept the system for what it was, and let things play out. But Jaden wasn't most people. Instead, he looked the judge in the eye and said, "Then let me be a witness." A hush fell over the room. The judge rubbed his temples before sighing. "Fine. Step forward." Jaden's legs felt like lead as he walked to the witness stand. He had no formal training, no authority, and no one backing him up. But for the first time in his life, he had a voice in a place that mattered. And he wasn't going to waste it. Jaden sat stiffly in the witness chair, his hands gripping the sides as he stared at the judge. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it might leap out of his chest. The room was eerily quiet for a moment, save for the sound of the court reporter's fingers clicking against the keyboard. The judge leaned forward. "State your name for the record." Jaden swallowed and cleared his throat. "Jaden Carter." The prosecutor sighed, shaking his head. "Your Honor, I fail to see how this witness is relevant. He wasn't on the witness list, and he is clearly just a—" He stopped himself, but not before Jaden caught the smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. He had been about to say just a kid. Jaden felt a surge of defiance rise in his chest. "I was with Malik at the rec center. I saw him there the whole time. He couldn't have stolen anything because he was with me." The prosecutor's smirk didn't fade. "And I assume you have proof of this?" Jaden nodded. "Yes. The rec center has security cameras. If anyone bothered to check, they'd see the timestamp proving Malik wasn't anywhere near that store." The room murmured, shifting uneasily. Even Malik's lawyer turned to glance at him, now paying attention for the first time. The judge exhaled sharply. Mr. Carter, do you have access to this footage? No, but I know it exists, Jaden said quickly. The prosecutor shrugged. So, in other words, you have nothing concrete. Just your word. Jaden clenched his fists. He knew what was happening. The system wasn't built for people like Malik or himself. They were expected to stay quiet, to accept whatever was handed to them. But Jaden wasn't going to stay quiet. Plea in her eyes. She had been fighting this case alone, but now, for the first time, someone was fighting with her. Malik turned to Jaden, his eyes wide with both fear and hope. Jay, man, what are you doing? He whispered. Saving your life? Jaden whispered back. The public defender finally cleared his throat, looking at Jaden with something close to admiration, maybe even guilt. Your Honor, given this new claim, I'd like to request an adjournment so we can obtain the footage from the rec center. The judge's lips pressed together in frustration. He was an older white man, clearly unimpressed with Jaden's outburst. That would mean delaying proceedings. Justice is worth the delay, Your Honor, Jaden shot back. A chuckle rippled through the audience. The prosecutor scoffed. Your Honor, this is ridiculous. We have a positive ID from the store clerk, and the surveillance footage we have clearly shows a person matching the defendant's description. Jaden shook his head, matching his clothes, not his face. More murmurs filled the courtroom. Jaden could feel the shift happening. Some people were actually starting to listen. The judge let out a long sigh before finally nodding. I'll allow a 24-hour delay to obtain the footage. If it proves useful, we'll reconsider the charges. Court is adjourned until then. Mrs. Johnson let out a soft sob of relief. Malik turned to Jaden, eyes shining. You just bought me a chance. Jaden nodded, but deep down, he knew this was far from over. Jaden walked out of the courtroom feeling like he had just stepped off a battlefield. His hands were still shaking, and his mind was racing. He had just stood up to a courtroom full of adults, some of whom clearly thought he had no right to speak. But had he really made a difference? Or had he just delayed the inevitable? As he and Malik stepped outside, Mrs. Johnson pulled Jaden into a tight hug. Bless you, child, she whispered. You did something today that most grown men wouldn't have dared to do. Jaden wanted to believe that. But as he looked around, he noticed the skeptical glances from the court staff, the dismissive whispers from the prosecution team. They weren't taking him seriously. What if they don't check the footage? He muttered to Malik. Malik shrugged. Then we make them. Jaden exhaled sharply. It's not that easy. You already proved them wrong once today, Malik pointed out. They weren't expecting you to speak up. They weren't expecting you to know anything about the law. And yet, here we are. Jaden rubbed his temples. He knew Malik was right, but the pressure weighed heavily on him. He wasn't a lawyer. He was just a kid who had read some law books and watched courtroom dramas. What if he had given Mrs. Johnson false hope? What if tomorrow the judge refused to consider the footage? He had forced the courtroom to listen, but they still didn't respect him. He could feel it. That's when an idea struck him. Malik, he said slowly, what if we don't wait for them to check the footage? Malik frowned. What do you mean? Jaden's mind was working fast now. What if we get the footage ourselves? What if we bring it to the courtroom and make it impossible for them to ignore? Malik's eyes widened. Bro, that could actually work. It was risky. If they failed, the court might not listen to them again. But Jaden knew one thing for sure. He had already crossed the line. There was no going back. He wasn't just fighting for Malik anymore. He was fighting against a system that thought kids like them were dumb, powerless, and insignificant. It was time to prove them wrong. Jaden pulled out his phone and quickly looked up the rec center's contact information. If he could get the footage before the next court session, he could force the court to take Malik's case seriously. But there were obstacles. Would the rec center even let him access the footage? Would the prosecution try to dismiss it anyway? And even if he got the proof, would the judge care? We'll need to act fast, Jaden said. The court only gave us 24 hours. We need that footage tonight. Malik nodded. Let's do it. Jaden took a deep breath. This was it. They had one shot to change the outcome of this trial. One chance to stop Malik from becoming another statistic. Tomorrow, he wasn't going to be just another black kid in a courtroom. He was going to be the difference between justice and injustice. The next morning, Jaden stood outside the courthouse, Malik and Mrs. Johnson beside him. In his hands was a USB drive containing the security footage from the rec center. Clear, undeniable proof that Malik was innocent. But getting it hadn't been easy. After leaving court the previous day, Jaden and Malik had rushed to the rec center. The director had initially refused to release the footage, citing policy. It had taken every ounce of persuasion, along with Mrs. Johnson's desperate pleas, to finally convince them to at least allow Jaden to watch it. And when he did, he felt his heart pound with triumph. There was Malik, time-stamped and in full view, playing basketball at the exact time of the robbery. He wasn't anywhere near the crime scene. Now, as they entered the courtroom, Jaden clenched his fists. Today was the day they proved Malik's innocence. The judge took his seat, and the prosecutor immediately stood. Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to remind the court that no official evidence has been submitted to counter the overwhelming case against the defendant. Jaden's stomach twisted. This was it. Malik's public defender rose. Your Honor, we have new evidence that completely exonerates my client. The judge raised an eyebrow. Proceed. Jaden stepped forward, holding up the USB drive. This footage proves Malik was at the rec center during the time of the robbery. It completely disproves the prosecution's claim. The prosecutor scoffed. And we're supposed to take this kid's word for it? Jaden's jaw tightened. No, you're supposed to take the truth. The judge sighed and signaled for the bailiff to collect the USB. As the courtroom watched in tense silence, the footage played on the large screen. The room went dead quiet. There was Malik, laughing, shooting hoops, completely oblivious to the crime he was being accused of. And just like that, the case had changed. As the video ended, a heavy silence settled over the courtroom. The judge leaned forward, expression unreadable. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, his once confident smirk gone. Mrs. Johnson gripped Malik's hand tightly, tears forming in her eyes. Jaden turned to the prosecutor. You said the security footage from the store showed Malik, right? Play it again. The prosecutor hesitated but, under the judge's glare, reluctantly ordered it to be shown. The video played on the screen once more, but this time, everyone was paying attention, not just to the clothes, but to the face. And it became painfully obvious. The person in the video wasn't Malik. The build was similar. The hoodie and jeans were the same. But the face? The face wasn't Malik's at all. The footage had been grainy enough that no one had bothered to confirm, until now. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Mrs. Johnson clutched her chest. You mean to tell me my baby was about to be locked up over this? She choked out. The public defender turned to the judge. Your Honor, in light of this new evidence, we request an immediate dismissal of all charges. The judge exhaled deeply. I'm inclined to agree. The prosecutor, now looking pale, quickly spoke up. Your Honor, while this new footage is certainly compelling, I'd like to remind the court that mistaken identity does not imply malicious intent. The clerk who identified Malik may have simply. Jaden couldn't hold back any longer. He identified him because Malik is a black kid wearing a hoodie. That's all it took. His voice shook with anger. None of you even questioned it. Murmurs spread throughout the room. Even the judge looked uncomfortable. Jaden had proven Malik's innocence, but more than that, he had exposed something deeper. The system had failed Malik before the trial even started. As the judge dismissed the case, Malik let out a breath he had been holding for what felt like forever. His mother sobbed quietly, gripping his arm as though afraid he might disappear. Jaden, however, remained frozen. He had won. He had stood up against a system that had been stacked against them. He had exposed a flaw that had nearly cost Malik his freedom. And yet, as they walked out of the courtroom, Jaden couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his chest. What's wrong, bro? Malik asked. Jaden hesitated before answering. How many other Maliks are there? Malik's smile faded. He knew exactly what Jaden meant. How many other kids had been accused of crimes they didn't commit simply because someone thought they looked guilty? How many didn't have someone to fight for them? Jaden had fought for his friend, but what about the others? As they stepped outside, reporters rushed forward, cameras flashing. Jaden shielded his eyes as a journalist shoved a mic in his face. Young man, how does it feel to have just changed the course of this trial? Jaden glanced at Malik, at Mrs. Johnson, at the sea of faces waiting for his response. He took a deep breath and spoke the truth. This wasn't just about Malik, he said. This was about a system that almost stole an innocent boy's future. And if it can happen to him, it can happen to anyone. The murmurs of the crowd turned into something else, something deeper. Recognition, understanding, and maybe, just maybe, change. The case was over, but for Jaden, it didn't feel like the end. In the weeks that followed, the impact of Malik's trial rippled through the community. News stations aired segments about how a teenager had exposed a broken system. People debated whether the prosecutor had been negligent or if racial bias had played a role in Malik's wrongful arrest. For Jaden, it wasn't a debate. It was reality. Instead of simply moving on, he and Malik took action. They started speaking at community meetings, sharing Malik's story, and raising awareness about racial profiling. Mrs. Johnson, once reserved and hesitant, became a fierce advocate, urging parents to teach their children their rights. Jaden also reached out to local civil rights groups. With their help, he launched a project to provide legal resources for teenagers who couldn't afford strong representation. He called it the Malik Initiative. When the local news interviewed him, he looked straight into the camera and said, "This case isn't the first time something like this has happened, and it won't be the last unless we do something about it. No kid should have to prove their innocence just because of how they look." His words spread far beyond their city. Organizations reached out, lawyers volunteered, and soon, Jaden's initiative became more than just an idea. It became a movement. At school, things were different. People who had once mocked Jaden for being a nerd now looked at him with respect. The same kids who had laughed when Ethan insulted him now listened when he spoke. Ethan, however, had disappeared from the basketball team, his reputation tarnished by his outburst in court. Though Jaden had no desire for revenge, he couldn't deny the satisfaction of knowing that his words, had done more damage than Ethan's insults ever could. But the biggest change was within Malik. He wasn't the same kid who had once shrugged off injustice, believing it was just how things were. He spoke with confidence, unafraid to challenge teachers when they ignored certain issues. He walked with his head higher, knowing that he had a future worth protecting. One afternoon, as they sat on the rec center's basketball court, Malik smirked. "You know, if you ever decide to ditch law, you'd make a pretty decent public speaker." Jaden laughed. "Nah, man, I'm just getting started." Malik grinned. "Me too." And for the first time, they both truly believed it. Jaden had always thought intelligence was measured by grades, test scores, and knowing the right answer in class. But standing in that courtroom, fighting for his best friend, had taught him something else. Real intelligence wasn't just about knowing things. It was about understanding them. It was about seeing the bigger picture, about knowing when to speak up and when to listen. It was about using knowledge as a weapon against ignorance. Jaden no longer cared about proving himself to people like Ethan. He no longer needed validation from those who only saw what they wanted to see. He knew who he was, and he knew that what he had done, what he would continue to do, mattered. A few months later, Jaden received a letter in the mail. It was from the state's most prestigious law mentorship program. They had seen his story on the news. They had read about the Malik Initiative. They wanted him to apply. As he sat in his bedroom, staring at the letter in his hands, he realized something. This was never about proving he was smart enough. It was about using his voice in ways that actually mattered. He picked up his phone and dialed Malik's number. "Yo," Malik answered. "You still got that hoodie?" Jaden asked, grinning. Malik laughed. "Man, I ain't never getting rid of it." "Why?" Jaden held up the letter. "Because we've got work to do." And just like that, the kid they once called dumb had become the smartest person in the room.